Hey, you guys remember a little guy named Horus Lupercal? Remember when he did some heresy? Well, guess who's back?
How many times do we have to teach you this lesson, old man?
I love the young people.
Hi, I'm Chrono the Harlequin, and considering the fact that some people have cited my quote, crackhead theory videos as some of their favorite content of mine, I think it's high time for a new one. So let's stop and ask ourselves what would happen if Horus Lupercal returned to Warhammer 40,000 in the current 41st millennium. But before we get into it, I would just like to say thank you so much for watching this video. Please subscribe if you have not already done so, it really helps me out, and without further ado, let's get into it. And it should be noted, this is not a complete out-of-nowhere theory. As many of you know, this actually may well have some solid basis in the canon. Now, the reason for that is from lore that comes up in the book The End and the Death Volume 3. And once again, I am sorry my full video on that has not yet come out. I posted a full apology and explanation of why that is at the start of my most recent video, which was Titans vs. Gundams. So I'll spare you guys the gory details, but trust that I am working on it and will try to get it to you guys as soon as possible. But in the meantime, I will issue a bit of a spoiler warning for that book for this video here. Because, as you know, Horus Lupercal is kind of dead. You see, in the old lore, Horus Lupercal's soul was completely annihilated. Not just banished back to the warp, not just gone, but completely removed from existence. Because the Emperor blasted him with a bolt of psychic energy so powerful, it would ensure that the Chaos Gods could never resurrect him to use as a pawn again. Because even though Horus had seen the error of his ways and begged and pleaded for mercy, the Emperor could still see that the Chaos Gods had control over him and would never fully relinquish it. So he had no choice but to eliminate him from reality. But in the new lore of The End of the Death Volume 3, that doesn't seem to be the case at all. You see, what happens after the final fight between Horus and the Emperor is that Horus brings his mace down and, reluctantly, it takes a lot of explaining, smashes the Emperor's skull. And, with Loken beside him, contemplates on what has happened, asking Loken to bear his father's body to show him respect in his death. Because Horus really feels this, the death of his father. But Loken says to him, "Give up the power. Give up the dark aspect you bear. Now is the time for things to change. You don't need the power anymore. Prove that you can." So, Horus, trying to prove a point, relinquishes the dark power. It all bleeds out of him, and he more or less becomes himself again. But then, it is revealed that the Emperor he just slew was merely an aspect, a shard of the Emperor's spirit. But Loken, who was talking to him, is actually the Emperor in disguise, who has now become revitalized by the spirit of the Astronomicon. I'm sorry, it's a lot, which has been relit by Euphrates Keeler and a bunch of humans praying all in unison. It is at this point Horus sees the Emperor, still very, very wounded, but now revitalized, and says to him, "You are no god." But the voices of Keeler and everyone else praying respond, "Then this will be a fair fight." So, there is a bit of fighting, but then the Emperor blasts him with sheer psychic power. And it is incredibly painful. It is more pain than even Horus can bear, so he starts begging the Chaos Gods to give the power back. But then he realizes they're only gonna give it back slowly. He was trying to collect the power back into himself, and he begged them for more, but since he spurned them, they're gonna teach him a lesson by making him suffer, letting the Emperor knock him around as much as possible before they give it back. And it is here Horus comes to his famous realization, that the Chaos Gods will give the power back because he is their most useful instrument, and that's all he is, just a tool for them. They played him, and now he is tied on the end of their string, begging them for help. He realizes now that this is the secret the Emperor bore alone for 30,000 years. He understands how predatory chaos is, how it corrupts people and twists them and lies to them, and how it seeks only the destruction of humanity, and how it was using him this whole time to destroy the one thing that could stand between humanity and chaos and keep them safe. The Emperor. He finally realizes, and his eyes beg the Emperor to kill him, to end this before all the power comes rushing back in and he's no longer capable of denying the gods. While he is in this brief moment of freedom from them, he basically begs for death, and the Emperor obliges by driving an Athame dagger into Horus's heart, killing him, causing him to melt into liquid, with all the flesh dissolving off his bones. However, there is nothing to really imply that Horus's soul was destroyed, especially when you consider that Athame daggers don't destroy souls. Maybe a blast powerful enough from the Emperor could have done that, but Athame daggers don't do that. They're known to stab demons and banish them back into the warp. They're known to kill people when you cut them in ritual ways. But they are not known to destroy anyone's soul entirely, removing them from the warp. But as many of you will know, the big thing about this is what the Emperor says to Horus. We get, in this instance, the only time the Emperor speaks directly to Horus throughout the entirety of the Heresy series. Even when they are together in flashbacks, the Emperor and Horus never speak to each other directly. And furthermore, the few things the Emperor says during this book, even in the presence of Horus, are never to him. He's either talking to the Chaos Gods, or Euphrates Keeler is speaking with the Emperor's mouth. So here we get the only time words exchange between the two, where the Emperor says to Horus, right before killing him, "I wait for you, and I forgive you," right as Horus dies free. As you can imagine, the line "I wait for you" has garnered no small amount of debate and discussion. Some interpretations I've seen around the web are that some people believe he's referring to Horus in that he will soon be dying as well, to his imagination, and joining Horus in death. However, to my mind, that simply isn't true, because it is also stated in the book that the Emperor had several contingencies, one of which being his own internment on the Golden Throne and endless suffering in order to keep the species alive. Yeah, the Emperor's suffering on the throne was absolutely something he planned for, and I'm sure he had more contingencies, so I doubt it was that. Some people believe that he was actually talking to all of humanity, stating that he forgives humanity for the direction they're about to take the species without him, and that he will wait for them so that he can one day return. Because you have to remember, the spirit of several millions of humans, a whole species more or less, was inhabiting his body as he fought Horus, because Euphrates Keeler and her prayers had empowered him. Remember, her voice could literally be heard out of his mouth earlier. But again, I'm not convinced. You see, the weight of that line really comes from the fact that this is the first time we have ever seen the Emperor and Horus speak directly. There was actually one other time, now that I remember it, in one of the earlier Siege of Terra books, I forget which, where they're actually speaking in the spirit realm to a degree, where the Emperor says to Horus, "Careful, Horus, I have power here," because Horus visits the Emperor in a past memory. But again, this is just messages sent through memories. It's not direct one-to-one communication. Personally, I doubt Dan Abnett would take away that kind of symbolism from the moment by having it be directed at people who were not even in the room. And speaking of people in the room, some people believe when he says, "I wait for you," he's referring to the Chaos Gods that he is now going to be battling against in the warp, and when he says, "I forgive you," he's talking to Horus. That's an interesting thought, and I think that might have some credence to the point where I'm willing to say that is probably the most likely option aside from the Emperor speaking directly to Horus. But for the sake of this video, let's assume both of those lines were directed at Horus, and the Emperor really said, "I wait for you and I forgive you," to him right before he died. It must also be noted that in The End in the Death Volume 2, we learn for a fact that the souls of all the dead Primarchs, including those who are not dead but are now demons, exist in the warp being tormented. At the time, Manus, Alpharius, Mortarion, Fulgrim, and Angron are all present in spirit form when Ferrus Manus talks with Sanguinius. They still exist within the warp and are aware of events going on, but their souls are imprisoned and being tormented endlessly. This actually lends more credence to the idea that traitor Primarchs can be redeemed, especially since the Emperor, speaking through Guilliman, says to Mortarion, "You may one day be redeemed," meaning that if Horus's soul was not outright incinerated by the Emperor, then it still would exist in the warp, just imprisoned. So with all that preamble out of the way, let's say that Horus Lupercal returns. The first thing we need to ask is, if Horus returned, would he be good or evil? And then we can really get into how that would play out. First and foremost, I believe Horus would be good, because in the end, he did reject chaos, even though it still did have a hold over him. But now that he is dead, I don't believe that hold would carry over. There is actually a line in one of the End in the Death books, I believe it's the second one, where Euphrates Keeler comes face to face with the sons of Horus Marine, who she knew back in her days as a remembrancer. And she can actually see his soul. It's one of the powers she has. And while his body is laughing maniacally about how he's gonna kill her and all the pilgrims and refugees she has with her, she can see that his soul is weeping. And furthermore, the powers of chaos were funneling their power back into him because he had begged for it and asked. So I feel like if he came back from the dead, that would make him effectively square with the house and he would be starting over. Sure, he would probably have to deal with the powers of chaos, trying to get his attention and win him back every step of the way, but I don't think he would buy it considering what he went through. And it also should be noted, he did come back once before as an evil Horus, that being when Fabius Bile cloned him in the book The Talon of Horus by Aaron Dembski Bowden. However, that book is about 10 years old now, and when a book hits 10 years of age in Black Library, that's when you can really start to question if it's still entirely accurate to the lore, but I don't think they would ever retcon the cloning of Horus. So yes, Horus has come back once before as a soulless clone that was imperfect and was destroyed by Abaddon. It was very symbolic, Abaddon destroying the specter of their father that loomed over the Legion and held them back, thereby severing them from their past and allowing them to move forward, no longer as the Sons of Horus, but now reborn as the Black Legion. This does, however, bring up the issue of a body, because while the clone of Horus had a body but no soul and was therefore easily destroyed, the new Horus would have a soul but no body, because as we know, it was destroyed by the Emperor. Remember, the two Primarchs who have come back, Lion and Guilliman, never had their bodies destroyed, just injured. And if Mortarion was ever to be redeemed like it was said, he already has a body, it would just need to be cleansed of corruption somehow. But what about Sanguinius and his appearances to people like Dante as the Sanguinor? Well, that is just a spirit apparition, kind of like an Imperial Saint. And I do not believe Horus Lupercal is coming as an Imperial Saint. You have to understand, part of being an Imperial Saint comes from the immense amount of reverence and belief people have in you. People like Celestine, and Sanguinius, who is the most venerated of all the Primarchs. So, putting aside all the gaps and getting to it, let's say a fully loyal and physical Horus Lupercal manages to return in the 42nd millennium. What would it be like for him and what would he come back to? Well, as you can imagine, he would be pretty shocked at the state of the galaxy, but I do believe ultimately he would seek to do good and help people, wanting to restore his father's vision. And as you can imagine, he would be extremely heartbroken the whole time he tries to do this, because you have to remember, Horus Lupercal saw a vision of the future, of the Imperium that was to come, when he was receiving visions from Erebus, back when he was injured on Davin and was effectively in a fever coma. He saw the Emperor worshipped in effigy on a shrine world, along with idols of all the other loyal Primarchs, which suspiciously excluded himself. And he cried up to the heavens, "Father, why have you forsaken me?" Not wondering why he wasn't being worshipped as well, thinking that he deserved to be also. And when he actually came to, he had a conversation with Malachurst, stating that, "My father made me for immortality, and the galaxy should know of me. 10,000 years from now, I want my name to be known all across the heavens." Well, oh boy. What Horus would come back to is a future where this exact scenario, the thing that spurred him to heresy in the first place, has come to pass, and it is entirely, unilaterally his fault. This is a man who saw humanity when it was on the very cusp of a new golden age at the height of the Great Crusade, now squatting in the ruins of what his father tried so hard to build, wallowing in superstition, poverty, and misery. And I need to stress this, he will know that it is all his fault. The shame, sadness, and grief that Horus Lupercal feels in his heart at the very end of The End in the Death Volume 3 would be magnified by 1,000,000. But I do believe this would spur him on to action, to do everything in his power to set this right, to try and restore at least a fraction of what he destroyed. But realistically, how would that go for him? Well, he would have an extremely rough go of it, because he would be entirely alone. You see, the two loyal Primarchs who came back, Guilliman and Lion, had their entire old legions to draw on. Now, Lion actually hasn't met his legion properly yet, as far as we know, but has been followed by fallen Dark Angels, ones he's met up with along the way, who were scattered after the destruction of Caliban and have flocked to his banner. He's been using them to help keep certain worlds safe in Imperium Nihilus, as well as put down fallen angels who are too far gone to join him. Guilliman, for his part, also faced opposition, However, while he was unilaterally accepted by almost all Space Marines of the Ultramarines bloodline at least, some Imperial Fists weren't too happy about him making changes, his biggest opposition came from the High Lords of Terra, 6 of which, while in reality 5, plotted against him to remove his changes. But most people were more than happy to accept Guilliman, because they recognized him. They saw him and immediately knew who he was. Rabute Guilliman, from the murals. Even the Chamberlain of the entire Imperial Senate saw him on the surface of Luna and instantaneously knew who he was and was awestruck. And when Lionel Johnson says, "Hey, I'm Lionel Johnson," most humans believe him. Most of these sources, by the way, are coming from the Watches of the Throne books and Lion Son of the Forest. But Horus, though, I don't think anyone would recognize him, because even the people who have seen his image are used to that demonic, horrifying aspect. This monster glowing of dark light with a menacing gaze, not the serene, calm face that Garvia Loken knew and finally saw at the end when Horus gave up the power. But that would actually be for the best, because if they did recognize who Horus was, oh boy, he would be in a lot of trouble, as you can imagine. You see, the average Imperial citizen doesn't really remember much about the heresy in the 41st millennium. What they do know is that the Emperor created humanity, and then sought to unite the species with the Great Crusade, only to be opposed by, quote, the 9 devils from outer hell, led by the great betrayer Horus Lupercal. Now, it's never actually stated what makes Horus a quote-unquote betrayer to these people, because the fact that he was made by the Emperor is a closely guarded secret. So, in response to this, the Emperor created the 9 Primarchs to oppose them, the greatest of which was Sanguinius, who sacrificed himself in the final fight with the arch-betrayer Horus. It was then that the Emperor defeated Horus and then ascended to the Golden Throne, where he now watches over humanity, directing the Astronomicon, keeping evil at bay, and performing miracles of sorts. You see, to most people in the Imperium, Horus occupies a Satan-like figure, where his name is actually used as a curse. One time in one of the Ravener books, a traitor who was captured and being interrogated by the Inquisition said, "Okay, you caught me. I'm Horus Reborn," sort of as a way to taunt them, meaning he still does exist in their consciousness, effectively like Lucifer. So imagine if someone returns and says, "Hi, I'm actually the literal devil from the Bible, but I'm a good guy now and I'm here to help." No, that's not gonna fly at all. And it would be even worse with the upper echelons of Imperial society, like the High Lords, who actually know the full truth of the heresy in what is known as the Forbidden Histories, because they know about the Primarchs killing each other, and it was one of the reasons why they didn't properly trust Guilliman, because they said, quote, "The Primarchs were patricidal lunatics who brought us to the very brink of ruin." And what about the Space Marines? That's even worse. They would never trust him and in fact would probably jump at the chance to get a piece of him. They would hunt him to the literal ends of the galaxy if they ever knew he had somehow managed to return to the galaxy. Like, my god, imagine the Blood Angels getting a whiff of this guy. It is so over. And worse off, he wouldn't even be able to fault them for it. But what about his brothers, Lionel Johnson and Rabute Guilliman, and whoever else is set to come back? Well, they're gonna hate him more than anything. They personally had to deal with the heartbreak of his betrayal and know everything he did, but they don't know about his final redemption at the very end. Maybe Rogel Dorn would, because he had a conversation with Garvia Loken at the very end, but still, I don't think that counts for much considering what Dorn did to Alfarius, barring some big character change, and again, this is all very hypothetical to Dorn's return. So, sticking with Lionel Johnson and Rabute, it should be noted both have gone through character changes since they've come back. Rabute is a much grumpier and more bitter person, but weighed down with a sense of duty, knowing what he has to do. He's lost everyone he cared about, and his new sons really just don't sit that well with him because of how they look up to him and worship him. So I can't imagine he would have any patience for entertaining someone who claims to be Horus Lupercal. But what about Lionel Johnson? He's the one who's actually had to learn about patience and forgiveness, accepting responsibility for his screw-ups with his sons and forgiving those who have thusly gone astray. Still, even with that, forgiving Horus is too much. But what about on the other side of things? The traitorous side. You see, there's actually an example of this, that being the clone of Fulgrim, who was raised in secret by none other than Fabius Bile, with the express intent of reuniting the Emperor's Children Legion and fulfilling their destiny. But this was only possible because they had stumbled across a massive repository of Emperor's Children gene seed that had been lost in the warp, but had now turned up again. So they wanted to use that to make proper uncorrupted Emperor's Children Marines, and possibly save and revert those who could be saved and healed, bit by bit, using Fabius Bile's knowledge of genetics. However, all of this was only possible because of Fabius Bile. He had the know-how to make more Space Marines, and could have had the knowledge to slowly, eventually, heal as many of the old Emperor's children as possible, thereby bringing them back to the side of good, under the rule of the new clone Fulgrim. But the Black Legion really has no such person, not even close. And they wouldn't even want him back, in my opinion. You see, the big thing with them becoming the Black Legion was to leave behind the past and start moving forward. That's why the tagline of the Legion is, "In Black and Gold Reborn." That's why Abaddon using the Talon of Horus to destroy the clone of Horus that Fabius Bile had previously made was such a big symbolic deal. He was rejecting Horus's legacy, stating, "We have outgrown you and we don't need you anymore." And then of course there are even the demons, who actually mock Horus's memory, referring to him as a quote sacrificed king and viewing him as a failure. The Neverborn would probably want to get at him to either remove him from the board by destroying him or bringing him back under their thumb as their pawn once again. Both are things that a reborn Horus would absolutely try to avoid. Demons would be after him, his old sons would be after him, the other Traitor Marines would probably be after him, normal Space Marines would be after him, the Custodes would be after him, the Inquisition would be after him, his brothers would be after him, every member of the Imperial Guard would be after him, even any Primaris Marines made of Sons of Horus gene seed would be after him, because they're not just gonna switch sides upon seeing him. In fact, if they knew that they come from his line, they would probably fight all the harder to kill him just to prove themselves. I mean it when I say there is not a single soul in the galaxy that a returned and redeemed Horus Lupercal could possibly rely on, as he seeks to do good and smite the enemies of mankind alone from the shadows. Except for one, his dad. Remember, I wait for you, and I forgive you. I genuinely believe that the Emperor is waiting for Horus to return, to try and put things right and do what he can. The Emperor is no fool, he knows Horus would be entirely alone. And remember, the Emperor has gotten in touch with Guilliman and Lion, contacting Lion through dreams, as a king in a dilapidated palace, or alone fishing in a lake that Lion could not get to. I believe through such visions, the Emperor would absolutely try to guide Horus and do what he can. But would Horus ever get to physically meet the Emperor in the way Guilliman did? I certainly hope so, because that would be a scene like no other. Horus, somehow, someway, getting into the throne room, a feat that would only be possible with the Emperor's direct guidance, and seeing what his father has become, or even more specifically, what he has made his father into. This withered, dried husk, in agony on the throne, mentally shattered, clinging on, staring down at him, and speaking to him in the same way he spoke to Guilliman, in fractured symbols and suggestions and meanings. It's actually funny, when Horus realizes the Emperor has tricked him in the End in the Death Volume 3 and is actually still alive, his human heart is actually partially elated. It says to him, "Your father is not dead. He lives. You didn't kill him. He isn't dead." Even though he knows he is now in incredible danger because he has given up the power, he still feels happy that his father is alive. Even when he thought he had killed his father, still in the grips of that dark power, he was still heartbroken at what he had done and struggling to rationalize and accept it. But seeing his father like this would probably make him wonder if it was even worth the Emperor living at all to go through all of this. He has ducked every force that the Imperium and Chaos can throw at him. He has had to hide, he has had to sneak, he has seen what the Imperium has become, the superstition, the zealotry, the squalor, the backwardness, and now he sees his father in unbearable agony on this throne, a broken man in every conceivable way, and he only can think this: it's all my fault. I've kind of convinced myself that I want this to happen. Before it was, oh, maybe it could happen, but I'm on the fence with what they do about it. No, now I've kind of convinced myself over the course of this video. Please give us this, GW. Furthermore, it's actually really interesting to think how Horus would have to go about accomplishing any of this. Because, again, he would be needing to do everything in secret, completely alone. Realistically, he would probably end up becoming a character like Cypher, slinking in the shadows, sneaking from place to place, and then disappearing as fast as possible. However, that would be significantly harder when you are a Primarch, because, yeah, it would be hard for a Space Marine, but Primarchs emit an immense aura. You can feel them coming from like a mile away, and there is nothing in the galaxy that is quite that big. There's a reason people immediately accept, yeah, you're the real Gilliman, or yeah, you're the real Lion, because what else could you possibly be when you're like that? I feel like people would catch wind that at least something is out there that needs to be investigated, especially someone wearing a wig, a beagle puss, and calling himself Boris. And yet, I don't doubt that he could do it. With the Emperor's guidance and the will to put things right, I think he could somehow do it. And, with enough time and luck, reports of a mysterious figure clad in a giant fur cloak, waylaying large armies and battle groups all by himself, would start to leak out across the galaxy, with entire groups of heretics, orcs, and other enemies of mankind found utterly destroyed, with no trace in sight of who did it. But what do you guys think? Do you guys think the return of Horus Lupercal would go something like this? Do you think he would actually be evil? Do you think he would return at all? Or should he even return? And what do you think the Emperor meant when he said, "I wait for you and I forgive you"? I'd love to hear what you guys have to think about this scenario and your opinions on it. Also, please subscribe if you have not already done so, it really does help me out. And until then, I will see you in the next video.